Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society. Lyndon Baines Johnson, or LBJ as he was known at the time, succeeded John Kennedy as President of the United States in November of 1963, when Kennedy was tragically assassinated. Johnson dreamed of building on liberal reform movements of the past. He called his vision for America, his vision for a new America, the Great Society. One could think of FDR's New Deal as a comparison. Indeed, the term Great Society refers to Johnson's program of using the federal government. So here's the key to the lecture, the key to the Great Society is the use of the federal government. In the tradition of the progressives, if you recall the progressives, they used the federal government to reform America, to make it more egalitarian. But also in the tradition of the New Deal, which Franklin Roosevelt again used the federal government, the New Deal, to help lift Americans out of the Great Depression, and again to make America more egalitarian and more free, that is, for more people. So Johnson hopes to build on those reform movements, expanding government to help the nation's poor, educate its uneducated, clean up its cities, and then provide medical care to those who could not afford it. In a speech in May 1964, Johnson said, "In our time, we have the opportunity to move not only towards the rich society and the powerful society." See, the United States at this time, in terms of its riches and its power relative to the rest of the world, was indeed rich and powerful. But Johnson wants to take the American people upward, he said, to the Great Society. And by great, LBJ meant generous, greatness of heart, humane, compassionate. Johnson told the American people that by using the federal government, he said, we have the power to shape the civilization that we want. For the historian, this is eerily reminiscent of what Herbert Hoover, President of the United States from 1929 to 1933, and most of you will remember Hoover as the president during the first years of the Great Depression. Before the Great Depression, Hoover had said similar things about the prosperity, about the future of the United States, and about the ability of the American people to, in Johnson's words, to create the civilization that we want. And of course, within a few months of uttering those sentiments, the United States fell into the Great Depression. So one should be careful of hubris, of arrogance. I'm not suggesting that the Great Society leads to a Great Depression. It clearly does not. But there is an attitude here, an attitude of pride, of arrogance that is a little bit alarming. Well, LBJ proceeded to attempt to do just that, to build the Great Society. He had the support of Congress, and he had the support of a large majority of the American people. The American people had moved towards this liberal democratic moment in the mid-1960s, and so Johnson is going to be able to, at least in terms of the legislation that he passes, build the society that he wants. Johnson's Great Society would have a clear shot at solving America's poverty problem, and that is to be the heart of this effort to solve the poverty problem. And how does one do that? According to Johnson, it's by using the federal government in new social programs, work programs, etc. But the question is natural. Just how bad was America's poverty problem in the mid-1960s when Johnson is attempting to address it. In 1965, the economy was in great shape. Seldom had the American people experienced better economic times than in the mid to late 1960s. Poverty in such a situation was declining, and indeed, poverty had been declining in America for decades. Moreover, the federal budget was close to balance. That is, we were not spending very much more money than we were taking in. The budget was close to balance, largely because the economy was booming. Booming in this sense means it's doing extraordinarily well. There is a boom in economic activity. The economy in 1965 was growing at about 5%, and it will improve on that through the latter years of the 1960s. Just as a comparison, right now, today, any president in recent memory would be thrilled with an economy that was growing at 3%. It's very difficult to grow the modern American economy at 3%. The norm is about 1.5 to 2% economic growth per year. So the economy in the mid-1960s is doing great, and poverty is on the decline. And this brings me to my thesis for the morning. You see, unlike the progressive era that we've compared the Great Society to at the beginning of the lecture, unlike the progressive era that was a response to the problems associated with industrialism, and unlike the New Deal, which was clearly a response to the Great Depression, the Great Society was a response to the wealthiest era in our history. So there is a fundamental difference between the two previous reform movements in the Great Society. In other words, Johnson's Great Society was a federal works welfare program initiated in excellent, indeed outstanding, economic times. Not a recession, and certainly not a depression. This then was a first in American history, and thus marks a change from reform movements of the past. Again, the difference is Johnson initiates this reform movement in outstanding economic times, not in the midst of economic problems. Now, just as an aside, it's important to understand why modern governments came to believe that it was just fine to spend borrowed money, that is, money they don't have, in downturns, because that was not always the response of the federal government in depressions. In the depression of the 1890s, the federal government did not feel the necessity to intervene into the economy and provide unemployment or welfare programs or anything like that. So, there's a difference here. The reason that modern governments feel philosophically free to spend borrowed money in bad times is because British economist, who was at least the most well-known of those economists who argued this, British economist John Maynard Keynes argued forcefully in the midst of the Great Depression that to borrow money in these bad times helps, and then spend it obviously, helps economies come out of the bad times more quickly. So government then is injecting borrowed money into the economy, which boosts economic activity. So that's John Maynard Keynes. Important for a person here in 2020 to understand the British economist John Keynes. But Keynes also said, and this is the part that people forget today, also said that the debt so created in the bad times should be paid off when the economy rebounds and once again we are experiencing good times. So pay back the debt. The reason for that, of course, is that so that when a recession or depression occurs again, you're starting with a clean slate, so to speak, because you paid off the debt. Well, Lyndon Johnson and most American presidents and Congresses have been halfway Keynesians. Even Republicans like Reagan and George Bush, halfway Keynesians. That is, perfectly willing to borrow money in a poor economic environment. Nobody even blanches at all regarding that, the way they used to. The problem, and the reason I call them halfway Keynesians, is seldom, if ever, do we pay back the borrowed money once the good times return. In fact, for the last several decades, we just continue to borrow money even in good times. This is going to end badly at some point. So essentially, the Great Society was based on the belief that the federal government can and should take wealth from one group of Americans, primarily for reasons of fairness, that is, those Americans who make more, who have more, and then give that money to the poor through social programs. Whereas the progressive movement and the New Deal were primarily responses to the economic conditions of their day. They were not efforts to redistribute wealth from one group to another. Indeed, those of a more liberal or even radical persuasion criticized the progressives, the New Dealers, for not attempting to redistribute wealth. Let's take a look for a moment at the Great Society programs. And while you can clearly note the tone of my argument here as being opposed to the Great Society, I do want you to understand that I'm not opposed to every single program that the Great Society launched. What I'm opposed to is the spending of money that we don't have, that is borrowed money, in good times. Well, Great Society programs. If Johnson's most spectacular victories came in the field of civil rights, and remember, Johnson is the president who followed Kennedy and made sure that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. These are spectacular victories. But his most ambitious and original program was the so-called War on Poverty, which is part of the Great Society. In 1964, Johnson requested of Congress nearly $1 billion, a lot of money in those days, to support a variety of programs to eliminate poverty in America. Now, there's the key goal. The optimism, the understanding of human nature, or the lack of understanding of human nature, was to eliminate poverty in America by the use of the federal government in new programs. So there's the standard. And then in 1965, the following year, Johnson came back to Congress and asked for even more money, and so the appropriation was almost doubled. It was actually more than doubled. The War on Poverty included the creation of Medicare. Most of you are familiar with Medicare, which provides health care for the elderly. I wouldn't suggest to the American people that we should stop Medicare. So Medicare provides health care for the elderly. It also created Medicaid, which provided medical and dental care for low-income Americans. Now, not every low-income American qualifies for Medicaid, but we do have the Medicaid program. Then, too, one of my favorite programs, a program that if I were president of the United States, I'd probably put more money into this: Head Start. The Head Start program was designed to help preschoolers from low-income families in poor areas get a head start in their educational experience, really to catch up to students who were more blessed in their home environments or in their income status or what have you. Head Start, 1965. Love Head Start. In short, there was legislation to combat pollution, to beautify the highways, aid college students. That ought to be a program dear and near to your hearts. Promote the arts. There were also new welfare programs and job and building programs, not to mention unemployment programs, all in the midst of an economic boom of great times. When Lyndon Johnson left office in 1969, and this is a a good way to summarize what he had done and his philosophy. When he left office in 1969, there were 435 federal domestic social programs. That is 390 more than when Dwight Eisenhower, left the presidency in January of 1961. So in 8 years, largely under Kennedy, mostly under Johnson, federal programs grew by 390 to a total of 435. Now again, I'm not going to ask you that statistic on an exam, but I do want you to get the sense of my argument here and an understanding of what the Great Society was and what it was trying to do. So I believe if Americans want to blame or give credit, depending on your political philosophy, and as I've told you many times, I don't care what your political philosophy is, but if Americans want to blame a particular or give credit to a particular era or president for the welfare state that we have, it should be Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society, not the progressives, not the New Dealers. And just so you understand, it is very popular to blame the welfare state, if one is opposed to the welfare state, on Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. And Lyndon Johnson is hardly ever even brought up. And so I'm arguing this morning that the Great Society marked the beginning of a new era in America. It's different. It's the era of the welfare state. Attacking the Great Society. Well, whether or not one approves of the philosophy behind the Great Society, one thing is clear. It didn't substantially reduce poverty. Remember what the goal was: eradicate poverty, eliminate poverty. I want you to understand that poverty under the Great Society does, in fact, go down for a number of years. But it didn't go down to the point that its proponents, its advocates, had hoped it would and said it would. And even the advocates of the Great Society admit this. It's not a point of contention. Again, poverty went down, but not to the extent that Great Society advocates hoped it would. Now, conservatives were not surprised by this. Conservatives say the Great Society didn't work in its entirety because its basic philosophy was flawed. You see, when one gives something away, it reduces the incentive for the person to work for that thing. It's free. And so the Great Society removes incentive for people to work and continues to do so. Now, this does not mean that every single person that receives a benefit from the government and says, oh, yeah, well, I don't have to work anymore. That's not the case. Many people take the government program or the aid from a program and it helps them and they then work their way out of the need for that aid. That's great. That's what it's actually intended to do. But not everybody does this. And in fact, the problem is pervasive enough that what happens is that by giving this money away, you create a class or a group of Americans who are willing to take whatever aid they get and just call it a day and not work to get out of this situation. This is human nature. Human beings, whether they have $10 million or whether they have $10, are still flawed creatures. They're still imperfect. They are selfish and they are greedy and they are lazy. And everybody in different degrees, but we all have these flaws within us. And to fail to take that into account in one's government policies is to fail. Policies themselves will find solving whatever problems they're intended to solve very difficult. So conservatives say that the Great Society doesn't eliminate poverty and doesn't really substantially reduce poverty because its basic premise is flawed. It removes incentive for people to work. And this still applies to government programs today. All right. The same arguments are leveled today. Liberals say it didn't work. And again, they're admitting that it didn't achieve its goals. It didn't work because America's problems according to these people, grew faster than our willingness to spend money on them. In other words, we didn't spend enough money. But the rise in federal spending under Johnson was, in fact, enormous. Thanks to Johnson and his successor as President of the United States, Republican Richard Nixon. So I'm not just blaming Johnson, I'm going to blame Nixon here as well. Thanks to Johnson and Nixon, by 1971, in the middle of Nixon's first term, for the first time in our history, the federal government spent more on welfare than it did on defense. First time. And here's the kicker. This is in a time when we are still in the very expensive tail end of the Vietnam War. Great Society programs caused welfare to rise from $10 billion in 1949. Yes, we had some welfare programs in 1949. To $260 billion in 1979. Now again, this is not going to be on the test. I don't put statistics on a test, generally speaking, and certainly not dates like this. But in that 30-year period from 1949 to 1979, welfare programs increased from $10 billion to $260 billion. And by that year, 1979, welfare in one form or another made up, again, more than half of the federal budget. And now to reiterate my argument, the main reason that the Great Society failed in its war on poverty, remember the goal was not just to reduce poverty, but to essentially eliminate it. And if it had even come close to eliminating poverty, I'd probably have a different perspective on it. But my argument is based on the nature of human beings. And it doesn't come close. And that's why. The main reason it failed was that simply giving money to people destroys their initiative to work. Again, not everybody, but enough so that the problems persist. The impact of the Great Society on the federal budget deficits and the national debt, I want you to look at the graph now. So if you take a look at the far right-hand column, that's the total debt, that is the debt as it accumulates year after year. And the column just to the left of that total debt on the far right is the annual deficit. So that's the amount of money that is either borrowed or comes in as a surplus on any given year. And you can see that there are some years when there is actually a surplus. But the closer we get to the present day, the more recent years and decades, you can see that it's very rare to have a surplus in an annual budget. So go down to the very bottom, you see the year is 2008. Go to the far right then, you see $5.8 trillion is the total debt that we owed ourselves in 2008 in the beginning of the Great Recession. Obviously, a recession, a financial collapse is going to cause the deficit to go up because the government then is going to spend money it doesn't have in order to get us out of the economic collapse. Again, this comes from the experience of the Great Depression, the New Deal. So I've added a few statistics here, and again, not going to end up on the test, but I want you to understand what's happening to the federal deficit. In April of 2013, about 5 years after 2008, and this is now in the midst of the Great Recession, and first President Bush, but later President Obama are spending money, we are borrowing to get us out. So now the deficit, the total debt, is $16.8 trillion in 2013. 5 years later, the spring of 2018, $21 trillion. Obama continued to bring the country into further debt, and much of this is explainable because of the economic times that he has to deal with. But when Donald Trump becomes president of the United States, he's not very concerned about the annual budget deficit. He simply wants to expand the economy even faster, although relatively speaking, the last few years of the Obama economy are solid, not spectacular, but that was the criticism. They're not good enough, and Trump argued that he could do better. And so he continues to spend borrowed money. In spring 2020, just before the outbreak of the coronavirus, the federal debt, the total debt, was $24 trillion. And I think most of you are aware that once the coronavirus pandemic hit and people were thrown out of work and the economy is thrown into the tank virtually, not just our economy, but the world economy, then governments all over the world began spending borrowed money again. And so there were several economic packages and programs desired to get money to American workers and American businesses and so forth that added to the debt by astronomical amounts. So I'm not even going to give you a total owed here in late April 2020, but just a couple months ago it was $24 trillion. It's substantially more than that now. Summary. I've argued this morning that Lyndon Johnson's Great Society failed in its primary mission to substantially reduce poverty. And it created a group of Americans more willing to look toward government, especially the federal government, for a handout than to their own hard work. People switched from relying on themselves to relying upon the federal government. This is a gradual psychological change. Let me give you an example. During the 1930s, the Great Depression, men oftentimes did not line up for the welfare social programs that were available because they were too proud to do so. They were ashamed. There is very little of that in America today. That has gone. And so as soon as a person is eligible, and I'm not blaming them for doing this, I'm just simply explaining how the existence of these programs has changed American psychology. But today, as soon as someone is thrown out of work, they will go right down to the unemployment office and file for unemployment. There's no shame attached to it whatsoever. There's no embarrassment. There's no sense of failure. So again, it's a change in psychology. The American people have begun to look towards the federal government for help when in the old days they didn't. Well, most Americans still recognize that poverty cannot be solved by simply giving money away. If that were possible, why don't we just give enough money to everybody and solve poverty? I think we can all imagine what would happen if we did that. However, that's not the whole story. The Great Society, like the New Deal, made significant changes in American government and American society, changes I've been describing. Medicare and Medicaid are part of the fabric of America. Federal money for higher education is expected. In fact, we're not discussing whether or not students should get government-backed loans. In the political climate today, we're discussing whether or not government should simply supply a free college education. Look how the debate has changed. And just as an aside, maybe you didn't know that loan you got from a local bank to help pay for your college education was backed up by the federal government, but it is. If it weren't, try going into a bank as a college student with maybe a part-time job and owning nothing, that is having no collateral, and asking for $30,000. If you did that, security of that bank would be called and you would be escorted out the front door and everybody in the bank would be laughing at you. No, your federal loan for your college education is backed by the federal government. They're telling the bank, don't worry, if they don't pay, we will. And that's how you get money for your college education. I'm not suggesting you should be embarrassed by that. I got money the same way. But the reason that program exists is because of Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society. The legacy of the Great Society is that more and more Americans began to look toward the federal government for financial help in increasingly more aspects of life than ever before. In addition, we, the American people, lost the discipline to only spend our own money. We began to borrow from our future and from foreign nations in order to prop up our current living standards. What does that mean, borrow from our future? So all the money that we are borrowing has to be paid back. Who will do that? Well, obviously the Americans who pass away in the next few years are not going to be paying that money back. What happens then is that your children, your grandchildren, and probably even your great-grandchildren will have to pay on the debt that we're creating today. So the future, by the way, people who have no vote, which is why it's easy to tax them, the future then is paying for our current living standards. If we didn't borrow this money, our living standards today would go down. Thomas Jefferson, by the way, president in the early 19th century, recognized this possibility of governments to do this, and he called it immoral. So we began to borrow money from our future and from foreign nations, places like China, in order to prop up our current living standards. This is unfair to future Americans, and it is absolutely unsustainable at our present level of borrowing. Well, I thank you for your kind attention, and God bless you all.